Well, good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, whenever you are tuning in to this Burlington. This is Burlington Mayor Mary Ann Mead Ward coming to you from the home office with another edition of Burlington Matters, where we talk about things that are on your mind and hopefully bring you information that helps you with your daily life. Today's guest, I'm very pleased to tell you, is Police Chief Stephen Tanner, who is from the Halton Regional Police Service. So we are going to talk about not only what's happening with bylaw enforcement for provincial emergency orders, but what's happening with our city in general through this whole pandemic. So let's jump right in. Welcome, Chief Tanner. It's great to have you on the show. I think this is the first time you've been on my show. So
it is. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So let's talk about the provincial emergency orders. We just heard this morning that the province is extending those until June 9th now. There's a whole whack of them. Why don't you walk us through sort of the main emergency orders and the ones that you deal with through the Halton Regional Police?
Certainly, and it really is a cooperative effort. I was going to say, we have probably now responded to almost 1,000 COVID-19 related calls in the city of Burlington. But about 65% of those have been handled and extremely well by your bylaw staff. So working together with the police service and Burlington bylaw in this case has been an extremely successful endeavor for all of us. They're handling so many of those calls, Mayor, and you should be proud of them for the work they're doing. And they not only responding to calls, which are triaged and dispatched through our staff here, but they're out doing things proactive. So when people would have seen some of them on Twitter on the Burlington beach over the weekend with some of the good weather, they were out there doing those things. That's in addition to the calls that we're handling. Now we're still doing some.
So what the calls that that we get, well, they would come through the Halton Regional Police and you dispatch to bylaw. Which ones would you handle as the police department, and which ones would our bylaw enforcement?
Well, we would typically keep some if it's an address that's been problematic in the past, and we can certainly identify a higher risk address, maybe not for COVID, but for other reasons. And then we would send our officers, instead of putting the bylaw staff into that situation. But they're also not 24 hours a day. So when we receive calls that are COVID related, we've got one neighbor where there's a neighbor issue and kids are out sort of partying on the street at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock in the morning. Of course, we'll be doing those. I think we handed out 28 provincial offense notices over the weekend related to COVID. So we've typically been dealing with COVID as a warning, as an education. There haven't been a large number of charges throughout these now 12 weeks that we've all lived through. A lot of it's been warnings, and people have moved off of parkland or out of those social gathering sort of situations. If they don't adhere to that direction, of course there are charges. So and they are being laid more now, I think, than before for people that are problematic.
So the 28 tickets, is that just for Burlington over that weekend, or was that Halton Region?
I believe that was Halton Region, although there were some that were related to the beach trip and some of the issues that were around it. And of course, with the weather yesterday and today, people are going to want to go to those parks. So we need to be so strong, as you are and as regional council is in the province. We still need to keep social distancing. We still need to wear a mask if you can't keep that 6 feet. I have not found it difficult to keep 6 feet of distance. Hopefully most people can, but if they put themselves into a situation, well, like the park in Toronto over the weekend, where there's hundreds or thousands of people that just happen, it's really, really risky. And why risk your health or someone else's?
Exactly. And people may not be aware that even though some parks are open, there's still a long list of things that have remained closed under the provincial emergency order, and one of those is our beach strip, so our sand beach attached to Spencer Smith. So the park itself is open, but and the trail that goes through the park is open, but the actual beach is closed by provincial emergency orders. And so I know it's a confusing array of of regulations that the public is having to learn very quickly, and it changes fairly regularly. We had that sort of brief, I think, moment of hope when things were being reopened, and then we saw the numbers go right back up again, right? And if people get careless or kind of let their hair down and start to come closer together or in large group gatherings, we call it the Mother's Day effect, right? That we're seeing now the impact of families just wanting to get together and friends possibly in some cases, and then we see the numbers spike, and then we're back. It feels like we're back to square one. We're not quite, but now we have to fence off it for our beach, even though it's signed closed under the provincial emergency order. So I know people are itching to get outside, but it's still so important, as you said, to maintain that physical distance from anyone you don't live with, and that's a Burlington bylaw. So there's the provincial orders, which are no more than 5 people, unrelated, unless all 5 are members of your family. You have to stay 6 feet away from anyone you don't live with.
Yeah, and I know we've typically in our pandemic control group talked about it sort of being similar to a roller coaster ride. We were coming down for a little bit, and we've got a couple bumps that we're going over right now, and that's going to be partly because people are starting to get out a little more. They're feeling perhaps too comfortable. They didn't catch anything yet, so they're going to be a little more risk adverse. And you're going to get people in some of those social settings where they still need to be careful. And we're also testing a bit more. So, as we test more, we're going to find more positive, and there's going to be a little bit of a mix in that. But by and large, we still have to be cautious and careful, or we're going to be back to, more retail stores closing again, or takeout restaurants not being allowed. So we need to keep it going in the right direction, and that really takes a community effort, and the police and the bylaw officers are just there to try to help people understand what they can do and not do, and in the worst case scenario, there's enforcement.
Absolutely, and you touched on testing, which I think is a really important factor. The province announced changes. They're the ones that set the rules around who gets tested, and are the ones also securing and providing the supply and the lab testing itself. So they've announced that used to be, unless you had symptoms or you were a frontline healthcare worker, or you had certain conditions where you were likely to have come into contact with somebody, you didn't need to get tested. Now it's anybody, but it's not walk-in. So I really want to reinforce that to folks here in Burlington. Our testing center is at Joseph Brent Hospital, but you still need an appointment. So we would just ask people, if you feel you need to get tested, to call ahead, make an appointment, and you will get tested. And you also, folks need to know that once you've been tested, you do need to self-isolate until you get those results back, so that you're not in that interim period, if it does turn out positive, that you're not putting other people at risk of infection by interacting with them. So a little public service announcement there.
No, absolutely, and it's so true. And the province is also starting to do some proactive asymptomatic testing. So they've approached us through the Solicitor General to request all of our police service facility locations so that they can go and, on a voluntary basis, test our members, even if they're not symptomatic, which is going to result in perhaps some positive testing. We have just over 1,000 employees in the Halton Regional Police Service, and we have only had 2 positive COVID-19 tests so far, which we're very thankful for. But the reality is, several more. Absolutely. We're and talking with our fire chiefs and our paramedic chiefs, their numbers are relatively low as well. I think our paramedics have had 4. Oakville Fire has had 2, and Burlington Fire, as of Monday, I believe, has had none. So great work.
Well, that's where the the care and precaution and the personal protective equipment that I know our officers are wearing, our frontline responders and workers, fire department, paramedics, certainly our healthcare workers, that's so essential. And the proper protocols, because often your work and that of our frontline officers will take you closer than 6 feet.
Right, absolutely. And there's times when we cannot help but get within that distance to make an arrest or help someone, overdose sort of situations as well. And they all put our officers and paramedics and fire at risk.
So what other kinds of calls are you seeing? Is, now that everybody's home, are there fewer break-ins? Is there less crime, or are some crimes going up? What's sort of the non-COVID picture for our police department right now in our communities?
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting ones, and I'll speak about Burlington specific for the purpose of today. Residential break-ins are down a little bit. Probably makes sense because more people are home, and a lot of break-ins to houses would happen during the day when houses are empty. And break-ins to businesses are up a little bit, which also makes sense because they've been empty. And that's one of the things we spoke to early on. There was a bit of a sort of a pressure in general around the province. Well, police can send a lot of their officers home because calls for service are going to go down. And we go, well, hang on, we have business owners who are concerned about their businesses that are left vacant, and we certainly give them advice on security and septed and not keeping money and valuables in the business to the degree they can. But those crimes are still going to happen, and they're going to be rightfully concerned about those businesses when they're not allowed to be there. So we've kind of juggled through those things. The trends are not severe in those areas. We've certainly, I mean, I'm looking out the window right now at the QEW, and I still marvel at the how far fewer vehicles there are right now on the roads, but they are increasing a little bit. Our traffic accidents, I will tell you, in Burlington so far this year, we've had 655 car accidents, 500 less than we had last year in the first period of the year to date. And our personal injury accidents, we've had 68 accidents in Burlington where someone has been injured. And that's a third less, or 35 less than what we had year to date last year. So there are some benefits from that. But we are also seeing, and police services across Ontario are seeing the same things, and that is some of the extreme driving and the stunt driving or the aggressive, dangerous driving, the 60 kilometers over. I mean, it was the QEW where two young individuals and their dad's Mercedes were going 308 kilometers per hour.
Cannot even believe that speed. I
it
mean,
is.
How did you catch them?
Well, it was that
Their
was the
cars go that
OPP.
fast?
No, it was the OPP, and thankfully, when the officer activated the lights, the young driver pulled over. If they had carried on and had a crash at that speed, I mean, that car would have disintegrated basically, right? So
Absolutely.
good for them for stopping. You have to give them credit for that because they could have panicked and kept going, right? And
well, it's interesting that you mentioned. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the silver lining, if you will, of reduced car accidents and certainly personal injury. We've seen in Burlington at the beginning of the pandemic, our traffic volumes, and we have cameras and counters on major locations, 60% reduction in traffic in the early days, but that's creeped back up. So now it's still about 40% less than what we would normally see. But it is going up. And yesterday, through downtown Burlington, we were out walking the dog in the early evening, and normally it's you can shoot a cannon on the streets, and it was packed. So I've really started to see some of those volumes pick up, and that's probably related to some additional businesses being allowed to be opened, and and that has an impact on our traffic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, people by and large are law abiding, and you're always going to get those outliers who are going to push it, and excessive speeds or dangerous driving and aggressive driving. And certainly maybe that's easier to spot sometimes when there's less cars, but our officers and across, as I say, across Canada are noticing a real increase in aggressive and stunt driving at that level. So something certainly that Mark Trasso and Matt Baker and others who you would see active on Twitter are after and stopping as many as they can. And distracted driving is just as prevalent. It's just there's less vehicles driving, but we certainly have to tell our citizens, put the phones down. When you're driving, you should be driving.
Absolutely.
There's no message worth taking your own life or someone else's.
So we talked about the break-ins and traffic. What other kinds of changes in activity in criminal behavior or crimes that you're seeing either up or down?
Well, I mean, armed robberies are down, but we had a spike in armed robberies and bank robberies early in the year or late last year, and we put together a robbery task force that was very successful in bringing some of those people into our justice system and charging them. Probably a couple areas that are really concerning to us as an organization and to me as the police chief are domestic violence and child abuse. And some people would say if you just look at the statistics, child abuse is down across the region. But a fair number of child abuse cases are brought to our attention by teachers when the kids, whatever age, are going to school and a teacher notices injuries or behavior. And teachers, of course, are legally bound to report suspected or possible child abuse. So ironically, we're losing the gateway of the education system for child abuse awareness and identification. So we're certainly on Twitter and with our local media have been pushing out the message that we still need people to be wary of and watching for any indications of child abuse, and certainly please advise us and the Children's Aid Society appropriately, because there has to be kids in our communities who are suffering from some form and degree of child abuse that aren't being identified at this point in time. So we really call on all of our citizens to do what we all need to do to protect each other and especially our children. And domestic violence is another area where domestic violence is up slightly this year compared to last year. But I think our police officers and our domestic violence investigators, and we have 28 full-time detectives who only investigate domestic violence in the region of Halton. So it's a very dedicated, highly trained group of detectives. And they, as well as our Crown attorneys, and I believe our shelter workers and Halton Women's Place workers would agree, there seems to be a bit of a tendency for the violence to be at a higher level. So the numbers of domestic violence cases reported to us might not be up by 10 or 20%, but the violence within some of those situations seems to be higher to us. And it's more of an anecdotal thing, reading occurrence reports and going over those things. But our shelters are certainly still busy. And Halton Women's Place continues to be such an incredible resource within the region of Halton, and one of the large facilities in Burlington is just fabulous. So we thank them for the work they do, and unfortunately we need that work to be done so often. But we also, I was just saying to the producer earlier, there was an advertisement on TV last night, and I didn't know what it was at first, but at the end of it, it was, sort of signals that, people, normally a woman in a domestic violence situation, may be able to make this specific signal during a video chat with a friend. And so it's going to be an awareness thing, because as the abuser may be inside the home more often now, or not having to go to work, or loss of income may add to some of the violent situations. But they've come up with this hand signal sort of to say, I need help. And a great idea. So many of us are turning to Zoom and Skype and Instagram and all the other things that we do with technology these days. So please, if you are in any way, the victim of domestic violence or of child abuse and of an age to reach out for help, there are ways to do that, and we're here to help.
Yeah, tragic side effect really of the isolation, right? When people are confined for longer periods, as you mentioned, if there's job loss, kids are home from school, so they're there. There's no camps available because of emergency orders, and so people are isolated and cloistered and confined. That's and right. It's a really difficult situation at the best of times, and you add that into the mix. So we do have on the City of Burlington, right from the homepage, there's a COVID-19 resource page where we've brought together all of the resources available, and of course Halton Women's Place would be there for sure, and they are open, and you can call them or reach out to them. The Kids Help phone line, so you were talking about kids who may be struggling or suffering. We know mental health is so important and also so challenging during these times. So there's a whole array of resources. If you've lost your job because of COVID, there are links to government programs as well as food bank supports and a whole host of other resources. So we've tried to make a one-stop shop right from our city of so it's burlington.ca, and then it's COVID-19 resource page. So you'll find a lot of help available. And then if you're somebody who's looking to help as well, we have a wonderfully generous community. So there's opportunities to volunteer, to donate. So lots of ways for people to get involved. And again, you're not alone. I think that's the message we definitely want to send, that you are not alone, that there is help available, and you do not have to suffer in silence. So please reach out. I want to turn to another thing that we're starting to see a little bit more of, and I know the police department is really involved in a very helpful and productive way, is folks who are homeless, or, we're seeing more of that in some of our parks and on our streets. And, panhandling has always been with us. What does so you have a COAST, and I know you'll tell us what the acronym is. You have a whole department with specialized services available to reach out to those folks. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, COAST has been here for quite a while, but we follow up, and our COAST officers and our full-time members follow up with people who have had mental health issues or traumatic situations that they have been through. So that they're not just going through the system and then left out there on their own. It's a reach out service where there is periodic follow up with the individual. There's also that relationship that is built between the COAST officer, and Chris Elliott used to be one of those officers. He now oversees a lot of our mental health response and our situation tables with our community safety and well-being plan, which is so well defined here in Halton, and we're so proud of it. Working with regional staff, and Alex and Jane and everyone at the region have been fabulous. But it makes that connection with the person who has had issues, mental health issues, incidents, perhaps been into the hospital and is out and now needs to be supported in the community. But we also have our mobile crisis rapid response teams, the MCERT teams, which you will recall because of your involvement at regional council and budgets. We brought that in a few years ago. So we have 4 teams of, it's always a police officer and a fully trained mental health professional, usually a psychiatric nurse, sometimes a psychologist, who will be in our vehicles together. And they respond to 65% of our mental health calls for service. So between those 4 teams, they will try to get to and either deal with themselves or assist other frontline officers working with people in mental health crisis. And we've done one other thing here in Halton, which we started last year, and that is to put every one of our frontline officers through a full 3-day crisis interaction training, so that they are much more highly aware of what a person or an individual is experiencing or going through on the mental health side. And you also may have seen a very interesting program we started recently with Axon, which is a virtual reality training which immerses our officers through 3D technology into a mental health situation. One is schizophrenia, where they're actually seeing the incident through the eyes of the person that's in distress. So the first part of that training, of this immersive training, is I'm now in this situation going through a schizophrenic situation, and the police officers are approaching me, and what do I see? And how does that impact on me? And then they switch out to become the police officer now dealing with the person in crisis. And it's really to teach them how to interact with people in a much more caring and sensitive way, and to understand what that individual is going through. And it's all about de-escalation and not escalating a situation where you may take it from 50 to 100 on the scale, and let's take it from 50 down to 20 and get the person the help that they need. So it's a combination of our COAST reach out program, our rapid crisis response teams, and the training that's going on behind the scenes. We want every one of our frontline officers trained to be that mental health intervention professional. And we're not all going to become psychologists or psychological nurses, but we can get closer to that. And it's something here we have the ability to do in Halton, and we're very proud of.
Well, it's so important to have that team, the crisis outreach support team, because as you say, often when there's an interaction that a police officer is called to, they don't need to be arrested. They don't need to be put in jail. They're having a crisis, clearly a mental health breakdown, and they need mental health supports. They don't need jail, and they certainly don't need an escalation in that situation. So it's a really great approach right here in Halton to have that team of trained people to be able to respond to those calls. And I know our community, I get calls from the community when they see somebody on the street, and they're always compassionate. It's, how can we help this person? Who can come and talk to and visit this person? And that's just so important. We just have a couple of minutes left, so I want to ask you what you're most looking forward to doing once we are out of this pandemic. I can tell you what I am, but go ahead.
I could speak to it in every one of our 4 municipalities, but there are a couple of restaurant patios along the Lakeshore and the Lakeshore and Brant area. Spencer's and Pepperwoods and different places that we need to get back to, and we can physically distance there for as long as we need to, but I really look forward to a sunny day where we can actually go somewhere, sit outside and enjoy all the great restaurants and services that we have throughout downtown Burlington and across Burlington. And I really feel for the restaurant owners, and I've meet with some of them and talked with some of them, and some of them are doing everything they can on the takeout side. Fabulous business people, but I really like business to get back to normal for them as well.
That's on my top list too. So thank you. We are out of time. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me and join the community and give this really excellent update around what's happening through COVID and beyond. Thank you, Chief Tanner, for your time. Just a little plug for the community that we do have our next telephone town hall. So watch for details. There'll be an ad in the paper tomorrow. We'll have information available online about how you can dial in. We've always had folks from our police department on that call, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again, Burlington, for tuning in to this edition of Burlington Matters. I'm Mary Ann Mead Ward, your mayor. Stay healthy, stay cool, stay safe.